Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start thanking STCCCV and AMCV for inviting me, and for Servier facilitating, and Pascal, obviously, for inviting me too. So it's my pleasure very quickly to talk to this topic about the global burden of disease. I like to think I haven't got a conflict of interest, but I show that for political correctness anyway. This shows the picture around the world from 1990 to 2019, an increase in the numbers thought to have raised blood pressure going from 648 million to 1.28 billion, so doubling over that short time period. And if we look around the world and stratify by sex, men and women, about a third of both of them, age adjusted, have the same levels. A third of men and women have got hypertension. On the right-hand side, you'll see the color coding showing the great variation across the world, and that's differential by sex, interestingly. 8 years ago, I said that raised blood pressure continues to be the biggest contributor to the global burden of disease and to global mortality, leading to 9.4 million deaths each year. But if we look at the most recent data from global burden of disease, that's 10.8 million deaths per year. Let me just remind you, that's about 30,000 deaths per day due to raised blood pressure. And I don't wish to understate the horrors of COVID, but COVID never killed 30,000 people per day, ever, and almost certainly never will. To one extent or another, it's going to go away, whereas these 30,000 deaths per day is going to get worse because the population of the world's getting bigger and we're getting older. So what are these deaths that are being caused? You see here the biggest contributor is ischemic heart disease, then stroke, ischemic and hemorrhagic, other cardiovascular diseases, and chronic kidney disease. Now that differential between strokes and coronary heart disease varies around the world. Certainly 30 years ago, stroke predominated, and I suspect it probably still does, depending where you are in Africa at the moment. But overall, globally, that's the situation. That's the breakdown of the deaths that are caused. Well, how are we going around the world in terms of hypertension awareness and control? This slide shows the data for women and for men in 12 high-income countries. A for Australia, U for the USA, 12 countries across the alphabet. And what you see is this very sad situation. For awareness, 3/4 of women and 2/3 of men only are aware. Control, and that control is to 140/90. We'll come back to that because we're getting more aggressive. But control at 140/90, almost 40% of women and just over a third of men are controlled to that conservative target. So not good. But things are worse where most of the hypertension is around the world, in low and middle income countries. And here you see 4 regions around the world. Let's just take the one bottom left. It doesn't matter which one we choose, but essentially this is the care cascade. And the first column is 100% of hypertensives in that region. The next column is how many had ever had their blood pressures measured. Next column, how many were diagnosed as having hypertensives, and then what percentage were treated, and finally what were controlled, to 140/90. Well, you see here, if we get these people and we controlled them all to the same level as those who have been diagnosed, in other words, if we get those that are diagnosed and bring their control rates up, treat them perfectly, we're still only dealing with a minority, less than 40% in that particular region. The majority of hypertensives around the world are untouched by the medical profession. That has got to change. That is a disaster for something that kills more than anything else, around 30,000 deaths a year. You know, and some countries will worry about what the best 4th-line agent for managing hypertension is. On the global scale, that matters not a jot. The majority are not getting treated, they're not even aware of their problem. Okay, well, that was the background, actually, that stimulated the setup of May Measurement Month in 2017, and it was designed to put a spotlight so we could increase access to blood pressure screening as potentially the most effective way to lower the toll on health due to raised blood pressure. So that was the idea behind it. And over the last 5, we're just doing the 6th annual screen now, or just collecting the data. You can see we've been over 100 countries around the world, which is very reassuring. But despite the fact these are just opportunistic samples, these are not representative samples, but I put it to you that doesn't matter a hell of a lot. Here you'll see from about 69 of these countries in over 2 years, it's a relationship between premature stroke in each of these countries on the vertical axis, premature stroke death rate, and along here, the proportion of hypertensives who had controlled blood pressure, i.e. treated and controlled in each of these 69 countries. And you see here this very strong relationship, highly statistically significant, and a quarter of the variance of premature stroke death explained by this very simple, crude measure, controlled hypertension based on opportunistic screening. Going back nearly 20 years, the British Hypertension Society said a very wise thing. Monotherapy is usually inadequate therapy. But if we look now at what's happening around the world, here you see the number on one drugs, that's the majority. If you're lucky enough around the world to get treated, the majority of those treated are on one drug. And that conflicts with what all the latest guidelines tell us. See on the right-hand side, PASCAR 2018, the European guidelines 2018, and more recently 2023, the International Society and WHO, they're all saying we should probably start with 2 drug classes if we can. And ideally, in an ideal world, if costs allow and it's available, we should be using single pill combinations. So what's happening and what's recommended now all over the world don't fit together. So finally, just to summarize my thoughts on the global burden of high blood pressure, I just think we should appreciate that controlling blood pressure, diagnosing, managing it properly is a top priority in global health. Before we get to treating hypertension, we should be starting higher up the chain and going for prevention. And with prevention in mind, we need to be educating everybody from all the health professionals right the way down to the general population. And we should be getting health promotion to work. And that involves governments, it involves supermarkets, the industry, all sorts of people need to come together to help to save the lives. More recently, the low salt trial in China, I think is a huge message. This really is a no-brainer. If we can get hold of low salt and get hold of it cheaply, we should try and infiltrate it into society as best we can. As far as diagnosis is concerned, well, it's quite clear we are hopelessly behind where we should be. And so we have to enhance screening. The latest European guidelines, the global burden of disease, say all of them promote opportunistic screening. We should be doing that. So please support May Measurement Month in all future years. That's one place we can start at least. Mantra for diagnosis. You cannot treat what you haven't diagnosed. Measurement is pivotal to allow to improve the control rates around the world. And finally, the management. Well, we need decent trial evidence by ethnicity, what the best drugs are, by the major ethnic groups around the world, and we don't have that evidence, and that's a huge indictment on the hypertension research community. And based on that evidence, we need then to produce cheap, proven single pill combinations which can be distributed equitably and effectively around the world. And finally, because there aren't enough doctors about, we're going to have to use community health workers supported by eHealth to manage this. And most nurses and people lower down the chain, if you like, than doctors are perfectly capable of managing the majority of hypertension. Thank you for your attention.